The small Korean peninsula, plagued by ongoing tension, was cast into war. The 38th parallel, the key line dividing communist North Korea from the non-communist Republic of Korea in the south, was where the North Korean People's Army attacked the South Korean nation on June 25, 1950, in a coordinated attack at several different points. North Korea had aspirations of conquering South Korea by force through their military power, their end goal being to bring South Korea under a unified communist regime. Due to concern that the Soviet Union or Communist China may have provoked this attack, President Harry S. Truman committed United States Army, Air Force, and Navy forces to the combined United Nations forces, assisting the Republic of South Korea in its defense. General Douglas MacArthur was named the Commanding General of the United Nations Command, or UNC, by President Harry S. Truman. The early days of this war were characterized by armies advancing and retreating up and down the Korean peninsula. The initial North Korean attack was strong and drove United Nations command forces to a narrow perimeter around the port of Busan in the southern tip of the peninsula. After the front stabilized at the Busan perimeter, General MacArthur surprised the North Koreans with a counterattack in September 1950 with an amphibious landing at Incheon behind North Korean lines, forcing the North Koreans to retreat behind the 38th parallel.
The United Nations drive into North Korea moved ahead with surprising rapidity. On 20 September, UN forces were fighting in the outskirts of Seoul, fanning south from the Incheon landing and breaking out of their old beachhead. By 5 October, Republic of Korea troops had crossed the 38th parallel and were 55 air miles beyond the imaginary border between North and South Korea.
Feeling emboldened, in October the United Nations, urged by the United States government, approved the movement of UN forces across the 38th parallel into North Korea with the hopes of unifying the country under a non-communist government. The Chinese government tried to issue warnings, but the United Nations forces moved forward the Yalu River, marking the North Korean border with Manchuria. Discounting the significance of initial Chinese attacks in late October, MacArthur ordered the UNC to launch an offensive, taking the forces to Yalu. To retaliate, in late November, the Chinese attacked in full strength, forcing the UNC in chaos to the south of the 38th parallel, allowing communist forces to seize the South Korean capital of Seoul. In early 1951, the Chinese offensive lost its vigor, and the UNC, energized and strengthened by the revitalized U.S. Army, retook Seoul and were able to advance back to the 38th parallel. From July 1951 until the end of active military engagement, the battle lines remained relatively stable, and the conflict became a stalemate. The Truman administration abandoned plans to reunite North and South Korea, and instead decided to focus on more limited goals, in order to avoid potential for an escalation of conflict into a Third World War involving China and the Soviet Union. General MacArthur publicly challenged the Truman administration's conduct of war, and the president was forced to state that he had concluded that MacArthur is unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government. The president then relieved him from his command in April 1951 and replaced him with General Ridgway. The new American president-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower went to Korea on December 2, 1952. Eisenhower followed through on a campaign promise and spent time visiting with the American troops, their commanders, and the South Korean leaders. He took time to analyze briefings on the military situation in Korea and eventually concluded, "We could not stand forever on a static front and continue to accept casualties without any visible results." Small attacks on small hills would not end this war. President Eisenhower sought an end to hostilities in Korea through a combination of diplomacy and military muscle flexing. On July 27, 1953, 7 months after President Eisenhower's inauguration as the 34th President of the United States, An armistice was signed, ending organized combat operations and leaving the Korean Peninsula divided, much as it had been since the close of World War II at the 38th parallel. The Korean War ended in an armistice, with neither side able to claim outright victory. The truce is still all that technically prevents North Korea, the US, and South Korea from resuming the war. When the armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, talks had already dragged on for 2 years, ensnared in testy issues, such as the exchange of prisoners of war and the locations of a demarcation line. Military commanders from China and North Korea signed the agreement on one side, with the US-led United Nations Command signing on behalf of the international community. South Korea was not a signatory. The armistice was only ever intended as a temporary measure. The document, signed by Lieutenant General William K. Harrison and his counterpart from the North's Army, General Nam Tu, said it was aimed at a ceasefire until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. However, that settlement never came, and a conference in Geneva in 1954, which was designed to thrash out a formal peace accord, ended without agreement. Despite the compromise reached during the war, the fighting has never truly ended since then. The Korean War was one of many conflicts in what was known as the Cold War, which was an effort pushed by the US to stop the spread of communism throughout the world. The end result of the war didn't really benefit anyone on any side of the treaty. It didn't even truly end the war. Since then, the Korean Peninsula has become one of the most highly watched places on Earth, as this totalitarian regime has spread terror and fear across the globe. Since its inception, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, more commonly known as North Korea, has become the world's most strict communist dictatorship. Under their totalitarian rule, the people of North Korea have lived in a police state, run by the army, and have been the subject of constant abuse and fear. On a global scale, the North Koreans remain one of the most difficult groups to rationalize with, as their strict policies and anti-American ideals are forced onto the negotiating tables. As their hate for America grows stronger, the threat of war looms on the horizon again. Through failures of our past compromises, conflict could once again become the first choice of action. However, the effects of a conflict today would be devastating. With nuclear weapons in our arsenal, a war on the scale of the Korean War could spell mass destruction across a continent. Until now, we have had relative peace. Unfortunately, though, the world we live in may greatly disrupt the ceasefire between nations. Due to the status of the current world leaders and the quick and easy methods of communication we have, starting a war in today's world could all dial down to the press of a button. Hopefully, though, we can overcome our past differences and reach a peaceful solution that benefits society and the world. The North Korean people still retain their wounds from the 1950s. Even today, we have no way of telling how the past will influence their modern decisions. It's important to remember history and study it to avoid making the same faulty actions again. We should use conflict as a way to evolve and to improve society by using the past to our advantage. While we do have to proceed with caution with the North Koreans, there's always a way to compromise for peace.